Top of the morning to you, or whatever it is. Forgive me, I no longer keep track of time. I'm from the past, and I'm here to tell you my story. A story about when I joined the United States Army back in 1846. I was part of one of the longest marches in history. I marched all the way from Council Bluffs, Iowa to San Diego, California. When I arrived, I looked more like a survivor than a soldier, I did. My clothes were all in tatters. My hair was long and shaggy, not at all like it is now. And I had no shoes. Have you ever tried to make shoes walk 2,000 miles? I was a soldier in the Mexican-American War, part of the Mormon Battalion. Most folks don't know much about the Mormon Battalion, or about that war, for that matter. You might say we kind of got eclipsed in the history books. The Great Gold Rush came along soon after that war, followed by the Civil War, and those were the happenings the historians were writing about. They couldn't very well write about some great battle of the Mormon Battalion because we never fought one. And yet, that war was one of the most decisive events in American history. Why? Well, before the war, there were only 28 states in the Union. The outcome of that war made the great westward expansion possible. California came into the Union in 1850, followed in later years by the other western states. How did I become part of that war? We were living in the East when we became exiles in our own country. Persecution was the reason, religious persecution. We were members of a new and little understood religious faith. We were Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we were different from most of the people in the area, different socially, politically, and economically. Some had moved to the area to escape the law. Some were slaveholders and knew we were against slavery. Others were just suspicious of our religious beliefs and our growing numbers. Well, the religious bigotry and hostility got so bad that we were driven time after time from place to place in Missouri and Ohio. Finally, our prophet and leader, Joseph Smith, directed church leaders to purchase a large tract of land, swampy and mosquito-infested, which was called Commerce in Illinois. But we changed it into a beautiful city. We called it Nauvoo, meaning beautiful place, and there we built our homes and a magnificent temple. It became a gathering place for us. Converts to the church came from many faraway places like Germany, Scandinavia, the British Isles, including Ireland like me, and from most of our 28 states and parts of Canada.
But on one very sad day, an angry mob murdered the prophet Joseph Smith. Some thought that would be the end of the Mormons, but they were wrong. The church continued to grow, but so did the persecution. We stayed in Nauvoo for another 2 years, a total of about 7 years. Then our new leader, Brigham Young, said we needed to move west, away from the hostilities, where we could raise our families in peace. West in those days was outside the United States. into Indian country and lands being claimed by Mexico. So that was another very sad time when we had to leave our homes and beautiful temple behind and move out onto the prairie. Our people suffered greatly during that winter exodus with little shelter other than some scanty tents and wagon covers. Many of the women gave birth under those dire circumstances. We camped in Iowa in places like Council Bluffs and Mount Pisgah, where we prepared to move west. One day, 5 soldiers on horseback rode into camp, frightened the women and children they did. They thought they were coming to take away our leaders. They were led by a Captain James Allen, who said he had orders from the President of the United States, James K. Polk, to enlist 500 of our most able-bodied men to help with the war with Mexico. That was a bitter pill for us to swallow. Why should we help a country that had done nothing to help us during our many times of need? We were not trained as soldiers or warriors. We were settlers and colonizers. Furthermore, our families needed us. If we left, young boys and old men would have to drive the wagons west.
Brother Brigham, that's what we called him, Brother Brigham, he saw things differently. He said this could be a great blessing to the church, and we could demonstrate our patriotism to our country. He said the church desperately needed money to move west, and it needed the cooperation of the government to camp on western lands.
The Indians were friendly to us, but the Indian agents were not. Brother Brigham said this was to be a mission for us. Well, the women folk didn't take any more kindly to the idea than we did. They thought they'd never see their husbands again if we enlisted. But one lady, she said, well, I'd rather be a soldier's widow than a coward's wife. Still, that was a hard, hard decision. Thinking about leaving my family to find their way through wild Indian lands without me. But I finally figured that if that's what the Lord's prophet wanted me to do, and if that's what my country wanted me to do, I'd better do it and trust in the Lord. So I enlisted.
It took about 3 weeks for the captain and his men to muster in the recruits because they were scattered far and wide for miles across the prairie. But in the end, with the help of Brother Brigham, he got his 500 men, and he also got 78 women and children.
Some of them signed on as laundress and cooks for the Army, hoping to earn the equivalent of a private's pay of $7 a month. And some simply refused to be separated from their families and went along at their own expense. Then Captain Allen received a promotion and became Lieutenant Colonel James Allen. And he said, we should be known as the Mormon Battalion, U.S. Army of the West. The only time in U.S. history that a battalion has been made up of the soldiers from only one religious faith.
The night before we left, there was singing and dancing and merrymaking to honor us, and lots of tears also. Then the next morning, we marched away to the English tune, "The Girl I Left Behind Me."
I am lonesome since I crossed the hill and o'er the moor and valley. Such heavy thoughts my heart do fill since parting with my Sally. That's the way the ditty went. And the wives and mothers and the children stood and watched as we marched away. And the tears, I can tell you, they fell like raindrops, they did. Colonel Allen led out on the east bank of the Missouri River for the 200-mile march to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. We didn't have much to take with us because we didn't want to take anything away from our families. We had to trudge through swampy land, sometimes up to our ankles, and the mosquitoes, they swarmed all over us day and night. One time we marched through the town of Weston, Missouri, and the whole town stood and stared through their doorways, astonished. They said only Mormons would have enlisted under such forbidden circumstances. Our musicians really outdid themselves and kept us marching at a good pace.
When we got to Fort Leavenworth, we received our accoutrements, but we were told we could send most of our uniform money, $42 each, back to help our families and the church. And so we were never really a uniformed group, except for the regular Army officers who had uniforms like these. But each of us received a musket and some accoutrements. The officer in charge was surprised that each man could sign his own name. And I might add that many of the men also wrote in their journals and diaries throughout the march. We were so anxious to get our muskets that we lined up early in the morning. The colonel said we could keep them when we got to California, but he also said we'd want to throw them away before we got there. He was right. This is a .69 caliber Harper's Ferry black powder musket. It carries a 1-ounce lead ball about a mile. We had to make our own cartridges with those lead balls and black powder. We kept our cartridges in a leather pouch attached to a white leather belt, and that went over the left shoulder.
We also had a scabbard attached to another white belt, and that went over the right shoulder, and this was called the baldric. And the bayonet fit into the scabbard. We also had a third belt to hold the other two in place. And we had strict orders to keep these white belts clean. No small order, I might add.
Each of us had a knapsack made of leather attached to a wooden frame. And in our knapsack, we carried our clothes, what few we had, and our other necessities. You'll notice a wool blanket on the top. That was called a bedroll because we would spread the blanket on the ground, lie down, and roll up into it. We were issued a cotton haversack in which to carry our dinner and sometimes 2 days' rations. We never had enough to eat. And we had a canteen that held 3 pints of water. You'll notice it's made of wedges of wood, and sometimes it would leak, so we'd pour beeswax in the bottom, and that worked fine, except on very hot days, of which we had many. We foot soldiers knew what it was like to be loaded from neck to foot with all of our accoutrements, carrying a heavy musket, marching through sand, sometimes up to our ankles, with the wind blowing dust in our faces.
We had already marched almost 200 miles. Now we had 700 miles to Santa Fe, hard miles from the very beginning. Sometimes the wagons would break down. We never had enough mules to pull them.
But the worst part was all the sickness. Sometimes we had to march with fevers, Even Colonel Allen took sick and had to stay back at Fort Leavenworth. He appointed the Mormon officer, Captain Hunt, to lead us to Santa Fe. Later, we heard the sad news that Colonel Allen had died from congestive fever, and that struck a damper to our feelings. He was a good man, and we looked upon him as a friend. Then a Lieutenant A.J. Smith showed up at camp and said he had been told to lead us to Santa Fe. Well, we soon learned that Lieutenant Smith was very unlike Colonel Allen, but we had no choice but to follow him because Captain Hunt, not being a regular Army officer, had no authority to requisition food supplies or to authorize pay.
One day, Lieutenant Smith pulled several of our sick men out of their wagons with cursing and threats because they didn't report to the battalion surgeon, Dr. Sanderson, to be treated. Now, Brother Brigham had heard about the doctor's medicine, so he wrote to us with these instructions. If you are sick, lick by faith and leave the surgeon's medicine alone if you want to live. He said, take only herbs and mild foods as at your disposal, and if you heed this counsel, you shall prosper. But Dr. Sanderson forced us to take his medicine from an old iron spoon, which he said was good enough for Mormons. Each morning, the sick were marched to the doctor's quarters, we called it the Black Wagon, to take their portion of calomel and arsenic. Now that likely was a common remedy in those days, but we knew that the men got sicker from it.
So determined was Dr. Sanderson that we should take his medicine that he swore with an oath that if any man gave medicine without his orders, he'd cut his throat. One day, Private Albert Dunham went to our Mormon doctor, Dr. McIntyre, to be treated, and Lieutenant Smith found out about it. He said, if you ever do that again, I'll tie a rope around your neck and drag you behind a wagon. Those who were too sick to march to sick call received not only medicine, but cursing and threats. We were not used to such language or such treatment. Christopher Layton, he said, it would be difficult to find any American community who would have submitted to the tyranny and the abuse that Battalion did to Smith and Sanderson, nor would we have done so under any other consideration other than as servants to our God and patriots to our country.
One day we saw a lake with mist rising from it. It was far away. Then it looked like a lake of clear water. But when we moved, it moved, and when we stopped, it stopped. It was a mirage and a great aggravation to us when we were so thirsty.
Finally, we came to a stagnant pond, but we had to drive the buffalo out of it. It was full of buffalo urine, bugs, and rainwater. But we had been without water for 48 hours, so several of the soldiers rushed to it, laid down, and began to suck and strain the water through their teeth to keep from swallowing the bugs. Later that night, many took sick from drinking the tainted water earlier in the day. When we finally came to Santa Fe, we received a new commander, Colonel Philip St. George Cook. But I can't say that we took a liking to him. He was mean, ornery, a harsh disciplinarian, and used very strong language. But later we came to respect him because he was a capable Army officer and knew how to look after his men. He was shocked at our condition. We didn't look like a battalion he could lead into some great battle and become famous in the history books. No. But later, he came to respect us also. But he said we had too many women and children with us who would slow us down and not make it to the Pacific Sea. So he, like Lieutenant Smith before him, sent a detachment of most of the women, the children, and the sick men over to Fort Pueblo, about 300 miles away. It was a pitiful sight, watching a wagon loaded with the bodies of sick men, looking like so many dead hogs, leave for Fort Pueblo.
Colonel Cook said he had orders from the government to build a wagon road all the way from Santa Fe to the Pacific Sea. There was no road, so we had to blaze one through some of the harshest, most uncharted, unexplored land on the entire continent.
It was 1,100 miles to the Pacific Sea, so the government said we could hire some scouts to help us. One of them had a famous mother. As you may know, the image on this gold dollar is Sacagawea, the Indian maiden who guided the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. She had a baby boy by a French trapper named Charbonneau, who was on the expedition. Her papoose was named Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, and he is also depicted on this gold dollar. Sometime following the expedition, the lad was taken to Europe, given an education, and then returned to America and happened to be in Santa Fe when the Mormon Battalion arrived. And so he became one of the scouts for the Mormon Battalion. The lack of food, water, and clothing caused tremendous hardship and suffering. Some of the men traded buttons off their clothes to the Indians for food. James Brown, he traded his belt to an Indian for a hatful of ground acorn mush. And one man, he used to slice thin strips of leather from his belt and chew on it for nourishment. When we came to within about 30 miles of Tucson, we had some real excitement. Several wild bulls got in with the cattle and were killed by the sheep drovers. And so when the company stopped at the San Pedro for water, several other wild bulls, frightened by the scent of blood, charged into us. A bull caught Amos Cox and gored him in the thigh before tossing him in the air. Levi Fifield had no wagon or tree for protection, and so he just threw himself flat on the ground and hoped for the best. Well, the bull just hopped right over him. Colonel Cook said he saw an immense coal-black bull start to charge on Corporal Frost. Frost just stood his ground while the animal rushed right on for 100 yards. The colonel, being close by, believed the corporal was in great danger to his life, so he shouted, "Fire! Fire!" Frost very deliberately aimed his musket and only fired when the animal was within 10 paces. The animal fell headlong at his feet. The colonel said that Corporal Frost was one of the bravest men he ever saw. When we came to Tucson, we thought we'd have some real fighting to do, because we heard there was a Mexican garrison waiting for us that greatly outnumbered us. But we remembered Brother Brigham's promise to us. He said, "If you live your religion, are obedient to your leaders, and attend to your prayers, you shall have no fighting to do, except with wild beasts." Levi Hancock had reminded us about that, but I'm sorry to say that a few of our soldiers forgot their promises and took to some swearing and other things not pleasing to the Lord. But most of us were true to our promises. When we arrived, the Mexican soldiers fled before we got there. To our joy, we didn't have to fight them. We raised the first American flag over Tucson. The villagers were friendly with us and traded with us, but we couldn't stay long because the general of the U.S. Army of the West, Stephen W. Kearny, needed us in California as soon as possible. After Tucson, it wasn't long before we again had to go on half, then quarter rations. Sometimes we had to boil bones or scrape hides to survive. Some of the men even roasted intestines and sucked nourishment from the soft edges of animal hooves and horns. It was pitiful watching the soldiers march along with their emaciated bodies, face is blackened by the sun, eyes sunken, and some of the soldiers fell by the wayside, totally exhausted. 4 women stayed with us the entire journey. Lydia Hunter was expecting her first child.
Melissa Corey used to take small pebbles and suck on them to try to stimulate the flow of saliva. She was so thirsty. All of us were half-starved, almost naked, but our burning thirst drowned every other suffering. When we got to Carrizo Creek, we figured the last few days had been the hardest of the journey. There was no talking. Most of the men could not talk. Their tongues were so dark and swollen. Many had scurvy. Several of the men carried water from the Carrizo back to the trail where those men had fallen by the wayside, exhausted.
The next day, fearing ambush, we marched close together. We paused after about 7 miles to a place called Palm Spring and rested and quenched our thirst amid the first palm trees we'd ever seen. We camped in a wet, grassy area in the Vallecito Valley where we recuperated. The colonel was surprised at seeing the half-starved, worn-out soldiers who only the night previous had staggered into camp from sheer exhaustion and hunger, now playing the fiddle and singing merry songs. The next day we set out in a northwest direction. Many of us had no shoes, so we tied animal skins or rags around our feet to protect them from the burning sand during the day and freezing cold during the night. 16 more mules gave out. We had started out with 25 government wagons. Only 5 were left. Then we came to a box canyon and had to cross through a narrow gorge. The sides of the canyon were too narrow for some of the wagons, so we had to use our picks, axes, and crowbars to hew our way through the rock. So we had to take them apart, carry them through, and reassemble them. That night we camped in the box canyon, and it was cold and miserable. One day we came to a steep, rocky hill, and men had to tie ropes onto the wagons and help the mules pull them up the hill. It was intolerably hard. Soon we came to a beautiful valley called Warner's Ranch, with the first house we had seen in California. At Warner's Ranch, we received our first full meal since our rations were reduced near Tucson. On Warner's Ranch, they had a hot spring where we bathed and rested and replenished our provisions for the last part of the journey. January 27th, 1847, just 6 months after we left Council Bluffs, we arrived at the deserted Spanish mission of San Luis Rey, which has now been restored into a beautiful historic mission. This was a day never to be forgotten. Just as the sun was sinking, we saw for the first time the Pacific Sea. There was silence as we viewed the long-awaited sight. No tongue spoke. Then, after absorbing the view for 20 minutes, we marched on. But cheer filled our souls. We had sung of the Pacific ever since leaving Nauvoo, and now we were marching to it. The sight was more beautiful than we had ever imagined, so calm, so peaceful, it looked like a mirror. We had just completed one of the greatest journeys ever made by man, at least in America. Colonel Cook said, "History may be searched in vain, for an equal march of infantry. We had completed one of the greatest overland routes to the west. The great march of the Mormon Battalion to the Pacific was finished. Company B marched on to San Diego and arrived January 29th. There were only about 300 villagers. Now, San Diego has a population of about 3 million. When we arrived, the fighting was over. We had marched 2,000 miles without ever firing a shot in battle, but we still had 6 months left in our enlistment, and there was work to be done.
Some of our countrymen had arrived ahead of us. Commodore Robert Stockton and John C. Fremont, they and their men had incited hostilities among the villagers. They didn't like Americans, nor did they like Mormons, because false rumors had been spread about us. Not only that, but Commodore Stockton had appointed John C. Fremont as the territorial governor of California, contrary to the orders of President Polk. It wasn't until our Company B arrived that General Kearny had the muscle power he needed to establish himself as the rightful territorial governor of California. General Kearny said we should go to work and build good feelings among the villagers so that someday they would want to become American citizens. We worked very hard at that. In the village, we whitewashed most of the buildings there. We built a bakery, a tannery, and a blacksmith shop. Because we knew how to make bricks, we fired 40,000 of them, the first kiln-fired bricks in California. And with those bricks, we built San Diego's first courthouse. We also lined roads with them and wells. The people didn't have a good source of drinking water, being that their wells were only about 3 feet deep. So we dug 20 wells about 30 feet deep and gave them a good water supply. The people loved us for it. After we completed our enlistment, 82 of us re-enlisted to work longer in San Diego. That was according to the counsel of President Young, who said we needed to earn more money before coming to the Salt Lake Valley. When it was finally time for us to leave, the San Diego residents sent a petition to the territorial governor requesting that he try to talk us into staying on forever as their protecting army. Then they added, if they can't stay, would you please send to us another company of Mormonitos? The other 4 companies had marched north. They raised the first American flag over Los Angeles and established Fort Moore. When they completed their enlistment, many of them marched further north to Coloma and went to work for Mr. John Sutter, who was looking for skilled labor to build a sawmill and a flour mill. And while they were there, they became part of the great discovery of gold. All of them could have become rich if they had stayed another year or two. But there was something to them that was much more precious than gold. That was their families. So they left it behind. So while thousands of gold-seeking immigrants were rushing west, members of the battalion were moving east and, on their way, built another great road through the high Sierra Nevadas. It's called Mormon Carson Pass, and there's a peak there named after one of the great courageous ladies of the battalion, Melissa Corey Peak, named for a lady who endured much hardship and suffering. Many years have passed since the great march of the Mormon Battalion. Some have asked why we enlisted. Well, it was for this that we sacrificed, and for our faith. Brigham Young said the Mormon Battalion was the salvation of the church when it desperately needed financial help for the westward exodus. And in addition to the many improvements we made in California, it's been said by some historians that the Mormon Battalion helped to extend America's shores from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from sea to shining sea. "23 of our soldiers died from sickness on that march. What sustained the rest of us? I can tell you in one word: faith. Faith in God, faith in His Son, Jesus Christ, and faith in a living prophet. That's what sustained us. And I might add that it's faith that will sustain you in your times of trial. I don't think any of you will ever be asked to enlist for a 2,000-mile march through uncharted lands, but you'll be asked to sacrifice in other ways, and you'll have your share of trials. Everyone does. It's part of life. So take a lesson from us on faith. Faith will see you through the hardships of life. That's what it did for us. And now, I no longer hunger, thirst, or fear. Christ said, I am the bread of life. He that cometh unto me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but in me ye might have peace. I must go now, but I hope to see you again someday in a place more beautiful than you can possibly imagine. So, take care, prepare well, have faith in Christ, and God be with you till we meet again.